Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Dr. Michael Licona, a professor at Houston Baptist University. Dr. Licona, I got to tell you really quick that, let's see here. When I was in high school, your book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, came out. And, I bought it, and I remember when I read it for the first time, just in one sitting. I got through maybe 300 something pages of it as a high school student, and it was just one sitting,
Wow.
And so I just want to thank you for making my high school awesome, because I really enjoyed the book, and man, I loved it. I got to everything except the very last chapter because I already agreed with you on everything before. And so I got to maybe finish out some pieces here and there. But Dr. Licona, thank you so much for coming on to my show.
Oh, my pleasure, Swan. And wow, that is impressive to think that you read through more than 300 pages in one sitting while in high school.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible book, but also, it helps that your footnotes sometimes cover the whole page, so.
Well, that just means it takes longer to read, right?
Right.
Or I
Well,
guess unless you're not reading the footnotes.
yeah, I skimmed a few of them. What was it? The one that blew my mind the most when I was in high school is when you cited all the scholars that accept the early dating of the First Corinthians 15 creed by Paul. I think you had something like 50 scholars or something like that cited, and a lot of them were from the Jesus Seminar, agreeing that it was within months to 5 years after the death of Jesus. I mean, that was incredible. So, Dr. Licona, what are you working on now?
Well, right now I have two books that I'm working on. One is pretty much complete, at least the draft is. So that's with Lee Martin McDonald. Professor McDonald is the foremost authority in the world on the matter of the formation of the biblical canon. How did we come to have the Bible that we have today in terms of who chose the literature and what processes were used? And so I interviewed him on my YouTube channel. It was 5-part series on this almost a year ago. And so what we did was we had it transcribed, and then we added more questions to it. We gave more robust answers. And sometimes, of course, when you're speaking on the fly, you go back and think, well, I wish I'd said something a little bit differently, maybe nuance that a little better, or just don't like the way I worded it. So we're able to word things more and more to our liking. And like I said, we're expanded it. And so now we've got a manuscript. We'll be submitting that to a publisher or so soon on answers to 100 questions related to the formation of the Bible.
Wow.
So that is done in terms of the draft. We haven't submitted it to publisher yet. And then the other one is a less technical version of my 2017 book with Oxford University Press on why are there differences in the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I've done is, since that book came out in early 2017, various questions, I continue to lecture on it, various questions and concerns come up. And so I make it a lot more friendlier for the person in the pew to read. And whereas the other book was written for, the Oxford book was written for an academic audience, more or less graduate students and scholars. This one is going to be written for the layperson and for serious students. So it would be appropriate for a graduate student as well. And it will address, it's for Christians though. It's for Christians evangelicals who have a high view of Scripture. And so it does a little more grunt work in explaining different things, and then also explains things pertaining to how this all fits in with the divine inspiration of the Bible and that. So so those are the two of the books that I've been working on, and the latter one is going to be, it's also geared for small group usage.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I remember, in a lot of your discussions, I remember like with, I think it was John Peckham and other debates that you've done, you really emphasize kind of a more nuanced perspective on the inerrancy of Scripture and what that all entails with inspiration and so on and so forth. And so, I mean, the book, The Resurrection of Jesus, this thick book here, what really amazed me is just also your honesty in the opening chapter. Like you talked about we'll get into some of this, but you talked about how, like, you're comfortable right now as a professor. You talked about, you're involved in a church, right? And so you acknowledge some of your bias, and you acknowledge that, yeah, I mean, it is more comfortable to kind of keep your Christian faith and to not have to worry too much about, like, all the problems of skepticism and so on and so forth, but you're honest about it and you disclose it. And so, I mean, I really appreciate that. It reminds me of your interview with Dale Allison. Dale Allison, I think, is another really honest person. But let me get to the first
Dale
question.
Allison, he was influential.
Mm.
He influenced me in that respect. I remember in his book, Resurrecting Jesus, which came out in 2005, I'd already been involved in my doctoral research for 2 years when that book came out, and I was reading it, and wow, I was just so impressed by his authenticity, his transparency, and I said, I want to be like that. And we don't have to fear truth. My whole thing is, we don't have to fear truth, but what we do have to fear is allowing our biases to guide us in such a way that they prevent us from learning the truth, and it costs us eternity.
Right.
That's a terrifying thought.
Right. Yeah. I mean, huge motto is just following the truth wherever it leads you. But that's a difficult thing for a lot of people. And so in your book, in the first chapter, you explain this concept that you call horizons, right? So what's a horizon?
Well, a horizon is, it's a worldview. It's one's worldview. It's more than that, though. It's their biases. It's their background. So, we're all influenced by our race, gender, our ethics, our nationality, our political, theological, philosophical, moral convictions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attended, the very group of people whose acceptance and respect we desire. All of this influences how we accept things and what we believe. So because these are so influential, most people don't recognize they have these. Everybody else is biased, right? But we're not. But we have these horizons, and they're kind of like a pair of sunglasses you put on through which we view the world. And everybody has different colored lenses. So, but those lenses, they help us interpret the data. And that's why we interpret data differently. Why people can look at the same data and arrive at radically different conclusions. There are many reasons for that, but the horizons of a person is the main factor for the difference, the polarity of opinions, whether that be religious, philosophical, or even in the United States right now, political.
I mean, but Dr. Licona, it seems as if we can't operate without horizons of some sort, right? I can't shed myself of my upbringing and certain things that I'm influenced by, like my community or the traditions that I grew up in. So, is the study of history futile without objectivity?
No, not at all, because we can work toward, you could say, transcending our horizons. We can never get out of our horizon, but we can recognize that we all have different horizons, and then we can work toward minimizing those. So, and not allow, what I find happens a lot when it comes to, say, the study of the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? That scholars are more guided by their horizons than they are by the data. And so if we're really interested, truly interested in arriving at truth, at discovering truth, and not just doing, confirming our view. So, a Christian could be looking at it. And I have to admit, when I started my doctoral research on the resurrection of Jesus, I did it with one objective in mind, to prove the resurrection of Jesus, to use it as an additional apologetics argument. All right. Well, that can compromise the integrity of one's investigation. And likewise, if you're a skeptic and you come to it and you say, well, I'm going to study this and disprove it, you face the same problem right there. It can compromise the integrity of your investigation. So I think you got to just focus on, say, what is the truth? I don't have to fear truth. I have to fear missing truth and what the consequences it may cause. And that can help guide us.
I think, one thing that you mentioned in your book and even in your other works is how even horizons can actually help us become better scholars, right? So you mentioned, for instance, someone who might have been whose family was the victim of the Holocaust, right? And then they're writing a history of the
Mm,
Holocaust. That
yeah.
horizon could actually help them become a better scholar because of how much they really care about the truth of the matter, right? And so, I mean, are there other ways in which, for example, as a Christian, right, your horizon as a Christian could help you become a better scholar and more honest, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, yeah. And let me add to what you were saying, because you're right. The horizon can help, but it can hurt.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we may not be able to know that before going into an investigation, right? If you're an atheist and you're allowing your horizon to guide your investigation, but if Jesus actually rose from the dead and Christianity is true, and you're an atheist allowing your horizon to guide you, well, then that's a detriment to you. And likewise, if Christianity is false and atheism or another religion is true, but if you're a Christian trying to prove the resurrection and you're allowing your horizon to guide you throughout your historical investigation, that's a detriment to you. It's going to cost you dearly. Now, of course, some people transcend that. So there are people, that who change worldviews. They do their study, they change worldviews. So they have transcended their horizon. It is possible to do so. But you're absolutely right about, sometimes the biases can help us.
Mhm.
So, the objection sometimes is, well, the New Testament, the gospel authors, we can't trust them because they were biased. They were Christians. In
Mhm.
fact, the Apostle John, or author of John's gospel, says, I'm writing these things in order that you may believe that
Mhm.
Jesus is the Son of God. Okay. Well, is that a reason um, to discredit the Gospels? I don't think so. I mean, what about the Jewish historian who's writing on the Holocaust? What about the African American historian who's writing on the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s? Are we going to say that they're not qualified to write on this? No, they
Mhm.
may be the best qualified to write on that. And it's important to keep in mind that not only are authors or historians biased, so are we, their readers. So when I was doing my research, I had just, probably over 200 journal articles I consulted, maybe close to 250 journal articles I consulted, and countless books that I read on the topic and consulted. Um, what I noticed at one point, Swan, is that if I was reading a book by, let's say, N.T. Wright, N.T.
Mhm.
Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, or something by Gary Habermas, William Lane Craig, or something that with which I agreed, I read it very carefully and I took copious notes.
Yeah.
But if I read something by someone with whom I didn't disagree, like someone with whom I disagreed, like Stephen Patterson, John Dominic Crossan, both members of
Mhm.
the infamous Jesus Seminar, I found that at some point I was just skimming their books. I wasn't reading them as carefully. And I woke up at one point and was thinking, I can't do that. So I had to go back and reread them and read them carefully because, I have blind spots. Everybody has blind spots. And am I doing with this investigation? I'm not putting down apologetics here. I love to do apologetics. Okay.
Mhm.
I love to defend the Christian faith. But when I was doing this research, it was not apologetics. It was to get to the truth, to see, could historical investigation, what would it actually yield in terms of the resurrection of Jesus? And if I was truly after truth, which I was,
Mhm.
um, then I need to read these others with people with whom I disagree. I need to read them every bit as carefully as I do those with whom I agree.
Yeah, and so speaking of which, then, like, you talked a little bit about this, but how do we transcend our bias or our horizons, right? What kinds of things or safeguards can we put into our methodology? You kind of talked about that a little bit, but could you expand on it?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's some techniques that we can do, and I didn't invent these. I kind of, saw these in the different writings and put them together to guide my own investigation. So I identified 6 steps that one could take that to help manage their bias, their horizons, to make sure it didn't unduly influence my own investigation. So first is method. So when reading about the resurrection of Jesus, and it's usually, mainly New Testament scholars who are writing on it. You'll have some philosophers and a handful of general historians. That is, those who are historians who study things outside the community of biblical scholars, such as, classicists and things like this.
Mm-hmm.
But the overwhelming majority of those scholars who are writing on the resurrection of Jesus are New Testament scholars. So one thing is method. So I hardly noticed any of those scholars, articulating what method they were going to use in order to arrive at their conclusion. They just started pontificating,
Mm-hmm.
or talked about, this is some of the things that we can know. And that's okay. But for me, just the way I'm wired, I wanted a specific method. And the one that was articulated by C. Behan McCullough in his book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, and then later on, The Logic of History, that made most sense to me. That really resonated with me. He, more than any other philosopher of history, articulated his method. And I was just so impressed with it. He's a great guy, too. I've communicated with him on several occasions. And we don't agree on everything, but he's my favorite philosopher of history. He's just amazing. So anyway, a particular method. I wanted to come at it with a specific method so that I knew what I was doing, and if I'm restricted by a method, as long as the method is good, that's one way to keep me from going off track and to keep my biases from unduly influencing my investigation. And as I discuss these a little bit more, I'll show you how that works. Another thing, second step, was to make my method public. So that way, and I usually do this in a lot of my debates, at least when I first started debating on the resurrection of Jesus, I would start articulating these. Or maybe I started that when I debated Bart Ehrman, because it's like, if I'm articulating my method, hey, you may not agree with some of the things, but where am I going wrong? Criticize my method, because these conclusions follow from my method. Where's my method wrong? And usually it's like, when I was debating Ehrman for the first couple of times, it's like, okay, well, look, we both agree on the facts. I'm presenting the same facts that you agree with. So where's our disagreement? It has to be with the method. Now, I've given my method and how I arrive at my conclusion. Criticize my method. What's wrong with it? So I make that public. And I also make my horizon public. Hey, I'm a Christian. I want the resurrection of Jesus to be true. Okay, I want it to be true because it gives me comfort in life. And I don't want to feel the discomfort of having to find another worldview, right? And if I come to the conclusion that Jesus did not rise from the dead, well, if I'm going to have integrity, I've got to give up the position I presently hold and find something else to do. So, so how do I combat that? Well, at that point, I held a position with the North American Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. I was also an adjunct professor at a seminary. And it's like, okay, well, wow, if I conclude that Jesus did not rise from the dead, I could write a book, a deconversion of another believer, right? And maybe I'd make a lot of money from that. So I'd use those kind of things to kind of minimize my bias, the things that were motivating me in a specific direction. But I wanted to make it public, my biases and my method. A third step is peer pressure. And what's good about the peer pressure is, if I'm given a lecture in a church on the resurrection, and let's say I mention the empty tomb, I could say something like, the evidence shows that Jesus' tomb was empty on Easter morning. And I can present the evidence, and I truly believe that the tomb was empty on Easter morning. I think the evidence justifies that conclusion. And I'm fine saying that. But when I'm talking to an academic, a scholarly audience, I have to be more nuanced, because a lot of them aren't going to see things the same way I do. And I have to acknowledge to myself, I have to admit that because of my biases, I will be prone to accept something sooner, more easily than a skeptic would. And so that could compromise. Maybe the skeptic is holding out too long. But because we all have blind spots, I may be too. Well, let me just give you an example. When I first started studying the resurrection, I put together an argument. It was a pretty simple argument. And I based it pretty much on one thing. Josephus said that the disciples, that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to his disciples. Now, it was a little more sophisticated than that. It was, all right, a lot of people, scholars, the majority of Josephus specialists would say Josephus didn't say it in that way. They do think that Josephus mentions Jesus, but they don't think that Josephus mentioned that Jesus rose from the dead. But there are a number of scholars who would say, well, since Josephus was alive shortly after Jesus rose, he lived in Jerusalem. His father was a popular Jewish priest in Jerusalem. So he would have been growing up at the very time that they would have been proclaiming the resurrection in Jerusalem. And if the book of Acts is correct, many Jewish priests were becoming Christians. So this would have probably been something that Josephus would have heard of about the resurrection of Jesus. Almost certainly he would have. And so even though he wouldn't have said Jesus rose from the dead, he may have said something that the disciples were claiming. They were reporting that he rose from the dead. And so the version of Josephus that we have today say that Jesus rose from the dead. And I think it's more likely that a later Christian redactor, instead of adding that to what Josephus said just about Jesus's death, Josephus probably said something like, they reported that he was alive and appeared to them. However, even though that makes more sense to me, it's not something that the majority of Josephus specialists have thought. And so I think that was probably a little too aggressive of an argument that I made. And so that's why I think the peer pressure, if I'm talking to a scholarly audience, I'm going to be more careful. And I'm going to be more careful to stick to my method. So it's kind of a check on me. And then fourth would be, I want to submit my method and my conclusions to unsympathetic experts. And I do that through things like peer-reviewed academic journal articles and books that are going to be reviewed by scholars. I also chose to do it through debate because I figured, well, my opponent has a dog in the fight here. I do, and we're going to put our best foot forward, right? So, but I want to submit my method and my results before unsympathetic experts because they won't have the same blind spots that I have. They're going to have different ones, right? And I don't have to agree with all of their criticisms, but I can look at them and say, well, they're probably right here. I probably have overstated this here, or I need to, there's a weakness in my argument here. And so that can help. And it did help me. Number 5 was I need to account for the relevant historical bedrock. Relevant historical bedrock would be pretty much facts beyond doubt. This would be what Gary Habermas refers to as minimal facts. And so these would be facts that are so strongly supported by the data that a very strong, overwhelming, heterogeneous consensus of scholars grant them. So heterogeneous, it's not just evangelicals, it includes agnostics, atheists, Jewish, progressive, scholars. They all agree on these things. And if you have a heterogeneous, nearly universal consensus of scholars, you can feel pretty safe with your conclusion there, I think. But I want the facts, the things that I grant as facts, to be accepted by a nearly universal, heterogeneous consensus of scholars. And so my hypothesis has to account for those. And any hypothesis that cannot account for the relevant historical bedrock needs to either be revised or trashed. You have to be able to account for the known historical facts. And then finally, is you've got to work on having a detachment from bias. And I know we can't really detach exactly from the bias, but we can try to detach ourselves from our desired outcome and really work hard toward discovering truth, and just keeping in mind we don't have to fear truth. So those are the 6 steps that I took in order to manage my own bias. And I find that very few scholars even talk about their own bias, much less on what they did to minimize their own bias during the course of their investigation. And let me just one other thing, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rambling here.
Oh, no, you're good. Mm-hmm.
Before I really engaged in this, when I was having a discussion with a non-believer, and we were discussing the resurrection of Jesus, I really feared them bringing up the matter of bias. I really did. It's like, oh, I hope they don't bring that up because I know I'm biased, as though they're not, but I didn't even really think about that. It's just, I just hope they don't bring that up. The more I looked at this and the more I dealt with my own horizon, honestly, authentically, genuinely dealt with it, it's like, I don't fear someone accusing me of bias at all, because yes, I have bias. And yes, I know that I worked hard toward minimizing the influence of my horizon upon my historical investigation. And I can just turn around and say, okay, this is what I did. These are the 6 steps I took. What steps do you take to minimize your bias?
Bring the table, right?
Yeah. And it's like, all right, I've dealt with my bias. I know I have it. I acknowledge it. I'm honest about it. And I've taken steps to manage that. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, and let me actually kind of pinpoint on reason number 5, or method number 5, that you gave for kind of dealing with bias. So you talked about like the minimal facts and basically a kind of consensus or scholarly bedrock. And so I want to first ask you, what is the value of consensus? And let me add a little bit to that, right? So for instance, take the dating of First Clement, right? So most scholars agree it's 96 to 99 AD, although, Thomas Heron and others have been arguing more recently that it should be probably pre-70 AD. And you articulate this in your book as well. And, I was recently talking to the biblical scholar Matthew Thomas, author of, Paul's Works of the Law and Perspective of Second Century Reception. And he comes down on the pre-70 dating. And so one of the things I noticed is that a lot of people seem to assume that when Clement talks about like the calamities that have befallen us, they're assuming this is under Emperor Domitian or something like that. And so sometimes, consensus can be questionable. And so I want to ask you, what is the value of consensus then?
Well, you're right. Sometimes consensus can be questionable. How we need to ask how that consensus was formed. So many times you'll have a consensus because scholar A said something, and scholar B says, well, scholar A said something, and then scholar C says, well, scholar and A say this, and pretty soon you got a consensus, right?
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, well, why is that consensus? In my field of New Testament studies, there's the matter of miracles, and can a historian investigate miracles? So you'll have people like Bart Ehrman and some others who will say, well, historians can't investigate miracle claims. Well, why not? Well, that's just the consensus. That's the canons of history. Well, wait a minute. I read historians and theologians, and many of them will say there are no canons of history. So they don't even agree on whether they're canons of history. A canon being something that is universally agreed upon by the practitioners. So we got to look at why there's a consensus. And then, if you're going to say, well, consensus, maybe someone says, well, Habermas is actually engaged in bean counts over the years on here's what the scholars are saying in terms of the empty tomb. Here's what these scholars are saying about the appearances. Here's what they're saying about the appearance to Paul and so forth. He's done this with more than 100 topics related to the resurrection of Jesus, on where scholars stand on these issues since 1975. I think he's over 4,000 sources right now. So his bibliography, and he's probably near 1,000 scholars, well, at least over 500 scholars probably. But here's the thing, you could say this to someone and they'll say, well, I don't know any, I don't know, most of the scholars that I know wouldn't agree with that. Well, okay, but But who are those scholars? Have they studied the issues we're talking about here? So if someone says to me, Mike, what do you think about, maybe they're asking me about archaeology. Well, the archaeological finds, a specific find in Jerusalem that occurred, a few years back. Well, my opinion is worthless with that because I'm not an archaeologist. Okay. And even in the field of New Testament studies, maybe they're saying, well, what's your view about, some of Paul's theology in his letter to the church at Rome? Well, I'm not a Pauline scholar. And even though, I might have a certain opinion on things, I'm not an expert in that area. I haven't written on it. The experts are writing on it. If you can have an opinion, but if you haven't written on it, you're not an expert. So who are the experts? What are they saying about this? That's the consensus that I care about. And I want to know, is it a heterogeneous consensus? So, I mean, there's a difference. There's a consensus would just mean majority. All right. So how strong a consensus is it? Is it 51%? Is it 90%? I'm more concerned about one that is heterogeneous as well. So, it's not just evangelicals, or it's not just mainstream or skeptical scholars saying these things. A heterogeneous, nearly universal consensus of scholars, for example, would say Jesus died by crucifixion on orders of Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect. Okay, so so there you go. I mean, that's a heterogeneous consensus, and it's nearly universal. That's the kind of, and if you've got a nearly universal heterogeneous consensus of scholars who are commenting on it and agreeing with it, that's what the kind of consensus that I value. And I want to be careful then that if I go against such a consensus, I better have some really good reasons for doing so. And if I'm going against, let's say I come up with something new and I present that out there. And sometimes it takes, a while for a new idea to catch on. But let's just say I put something out there and 20 years later, I still have all these negative reviews. Let's just say my book, Why Are There Differences on the Gospels? Okay. And let's say 20 years from now, I have 95% negative reviews on that book. Then I probably should step back and say, you know what? There's a good chance I'm wrong on what I'm proposing there. So, yeah, I think that can be the role of consensus.
And then, moving on, in your first chapter in the book on the resurrection of Jesus, you mentioned that even if we don't have absolute certainty in historical knowledge, we can have adequate certainty. And so I really liked that distinction. And so can you talk about what you mean by kind of adequate certainty there?
Sure. I just turned 60 2 weeks ago. And yeah, 60. It's like,
You don't look
did that
60.
time go? And it's like, okay. Over my years, I've had a number of different surgeries, and, you get into the operating room and they try to make it as sterile as possible, germ-free as possible. Well, there's no operating room that is 100% sterile. So you don't have absolute 100% sterile environment, but those ORs are usually adequately sterile. So we get in the car, we drive wherever we're going because we have reasonable certainty, adequate certainty that we're going to get there safely. If I get on a plane to fly, I'm not absolutely certain. I'm not 100% confident that I'm going to make it safely to my destination, but I'm reasonably certain. I could be wrong, but I'm reasonably certain. And that's good enough for me to get on the plane. That's good enough for me to get in the car and drive it. I have adequate confidence that I can make it to my destination. And it's the same thing before I come to conclusion, I can never get into a time machine and go back to the first century to verify whether Jesus rose from the dead. Neither can I do so to verify that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. but I can have reasonable, adequate certainty that these events occurred.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one time, someone kind of asked me, Swan, what if Jesus wasn't like, other Palestinian Jews or something like that? And so I was saying, like, well, I wasn't there in the first century, and so I can't say with absolute certainty, okay, that proposal's false, right? But I mean, I don't know, it strikes me as really difficult. Like, it's like our historical knowledge isn't absolutely certain. And so, there are those kind of concerns about maybe my memories developed 5 minutes ago and the world has the appearance of age or something like that. Right. And so, but at the same time, like these are just things that we don't really practically question. Right. Or worry about so much. And so I don't know, moving into our next question a little bit,
Well,
with
hang on though.
post.
Let me
Yeah.
just
Okay,
say
sure.
one thing here.
Yeah.
One thing that has helped me over the time, and it's like a light bulb went off as I'm studying this years ago. You're right. We can't have absolute certainty, absolute confidence about this. And it could always be the case that we were created just 5 minutes ago with these memories, right? But someone who wants to accept that, they can't be absolutely certain that that's true.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of, well, what seems most plausible? What seems most reasonable to believe? Is it more reasonable to believe that I'm 60 years old, that I grew up in Baltimore, that I live in a suburb of Atlanta now and teach at Houston Baptist University, that I'm talking to Swan right now? Or is it more reasonable for me to think that I'm a brain in a vat somewhere being stimulated by a mad scientist to have the perceptions that these things are happening, or that I was created just 5 minutes ago with these false memories?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to go with the first. I can't prove it, but I think the first is going to be the most reasonable, plausible explanation.
I mean, so, on the topic of skepticism, right? So, you talk about postmodern historiography. And so I want to ask you, what is postmodern historiography and to what extent has it influenced not only New Testament scholars, but everyday people?
Well, postmodernism takes different shapes and forms. So it's going to be a little different in the English department or in the art department than it's going to be in classical or New Testament studies. So when it comes, the story of the discipline of history.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to history, you're looking at the uncertainty of knowledge. Okay, that's where we start off with postmodernism. You recognize that knowledge of the past is uncertain. Why? Well, because first of all, the event that occurred, let's just take, for example, I don't know, we can just name anything.
The destruction of the temple.
Destruction of the temple in AD 70, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So that is an event. It is forever gone. We can't repeat that. We can't get into the time machine, go to the past and relive that, okay? It is gone. It is forever gone. What do we have? Well, you've got reports. You have Josephus, you have others. You got these reports of what happened, okay? So this person who's reporting it, let's just take Josephus. He's reporting it, but he's a Jew. He's got his own biases, right? Mm. And so he's interpreting that event through his own horizons of a Jew who fought against the Romans, was defeated by the Romans, joined the Romans, was scorned by much of his fellow people, the Jews, and now he's writing a history of the Jews, and he's writing this to appeal to the Romans. And so he's got his own horizons. He's reporting the destruction of the temple. Okay, so, but we're seeing that through the lens of Josephus. And then, you might have a different event, like, for example, let's talk about Plutarch discussing Caesar crossing the Rubicon. All right, now, Plutarch wasn't there. Plutarch's born around the year 40. Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC. So, almost 90 years later. 91 years later, before. Mm-hmm. Plutarch's before Plutarch was born, and he's writing this probably just after the year 100. So it's about 150 years prior to when Plutarch's writing this, and Plutarch certainly wasn't an eyewitness. Plutarch is using Asinius Pollio as his source for that, most likely. That's what Plutarch specialists would say. And we don't have Pollio's writings. They've been lost. But Pollio was probably there at the Rubicon crossing. He was an eyewitness. But Pollio is still interpreting the Rubicon crossing through the lens of his own horizon. So you've got the event itself, the Rubicon crossing, then you've got Pollio's interpretation of that event, and then you have Plutarch, who has his own horizon, who's interpreting Pollio. So what we are reading in Plutarch's Life of Caesar is we are reading an interpretation of someone else's interpretation of an event that we cannot recapture. Mm-hmm. And so you look at these kinds of things and it's like, okay, well, that's the uncertainty of historical knowledge. And there's more to it than that. So what a postmodernist will do is say, you know, we can't go back to the event itself. We can't talk about facts. All we can talk about is an interpretation of facts. And here we're an interpretation of facts, but those facts are not recoverable to us today. And so you'll have radical postmodernists who will say all reconstructions of the past are fiction. None of them are exactly what happened. So everything that's a history of the past is a historical fiction because it's just based largely on interpretation. Now that's a radical postmodernism. A more, you know, I would say call it a reasonable postmodernism would say, you know, we just have to be really careful. And, you know, you're going to have some people like, you know, one of my favorite New Testament scholars is Dale Allison. I think he's just an extraordinary New Testament scholar. I do think that he and a number of other New Testament scholars are somewhat influenced by the postmodernist movement. Now, I could be wrong, and maybe they probably think that I, as a realist historian, who think that we can recover the past at least to an extent. I'm not saying that we can know it exactly as it happened or verify that it happened exactly as reported, but you know, I have a little more confidence that we can arrive at conclusions than some of these others do. So maybe they would call me a naive realist. And of course, I have to look at the possibility that that's the case. But I do think that some of them are more influenced by postmodernism than they may be aware. And it's just because of the uncertainty of historical knowledge. So I look at more, you know, I can look at possibilities, but I'm more concerned with probabilities and then just saying, okay, this is a provisional conclusion I have. I acknowledge it could be otherwise, but I do think that the data strongly suggests that this is what occurred. So that's the difference between a realist historian and a postmodernist historian.
Yeah,
and right now,
sorry.
I asked Behan McCullough, he said about 50% of philosophers of history are postmodernist, whereas the other 50% are realist. He says it's about evenly divided. But even postmodernist philosophers of history acknowledge that by and large, practicing historians today are realist historians. By far, they're realist historians. Unfortunately, the field of New Testament studies, they haven't really gone into this debate. Well, I mean, they have in terms of the, you know, the postmodernist realist debate, but they haven't really engaged too much. You have some of them like Scott McKnight, he's engaged with the postmodernist historians and the realist historians and read the literature written by the philosophers of history, whereas most New Testament scholars haven't. And so they think they're paving new ground, but they're not. They're, you know, they go through all this stuff and then they end at this place where the campfire has been put out and the ashes are cold. It's like, hey, buddy, you missed the party. It's over and you missed it. You know, we've moved on from here. You know, it's like what the philosophers of history would say.
Yeah, I mean, so if you don't mind, I might go a little off script here, but you know, I wanted to get your thoughts on also like redaction criticism, right? Because sometimes when I'm reading a New Testament commentary, I feel a little frustrated when I'm reading it and the person's like, yeah, you know, Jesus probably didn't say this, and this is probably the Mathane community reading into the words of Jesus or something like that, right? And so, I mean, there is a place for redaction criticism, sure, right? But I mean, you know, what are your thoughts on that form of criticism?
Well, redaction, just for our viewers here, redaction just simply means edit, right? And so redaction criticism, you know, you've got this approach to the New Testament, the Gospels, and you say, okay, well, what were the redactions? The majority of scholars today, including evangelicals, do think that Mark wrote first and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their primary source and supplemented it. Okay, so then we can look at how Matthew, when there's a story that's reported by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and let's say there's verbal similarities between them, then it's probably the case that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their source, and they redact Mark. So in that case, if they edit Mark, what are they saying? What is the redaction? And does that say something about the theology? So I'm just, one example that comes to mind would be, I forgot what chapter it is in Mark, but Jesus says, what are other people saying about me? Well, he's a prophet, he's Elijah, he's John the Baptist. Well, what do you say? And Peter says, well, you are the Messiah of God. You're the Messiah. That's Mark. Then Matthew, Peter answers, you're the Messiah, the son of the most, you're the son of the most high God, something like that.
Yeah.
So you've got a little bit more there. So Matthew redacts Mark. Well, maybe, remember, Matthew wasn't, well, I guess he could have, yeah, Matthew was there at that. I got that confused with the transfiguration.
You're good.
So Matthew could have been there. Maybe Matthew knows a little bit more. He remembers more of what Peter said at that point. And, you know, Mark was just, he remembered what Peter said, told him, but he didn't remember it as well as Matthew. So it could be that Matthew just has a better memory there. Or it could be that Matthew has redacted it and included the Son of God for theological purposes. Redaction criticism tries to consider that kind of stuff and then say, well, as a whole, what's Matthew doing here theologically throughout his gospel? Now, it's just like other things like higher criticism. You'll find some evangelicals who are maybe a little naive and they say, well, higher criticism is bad. Well, no, higher criticism isn't bad, but higher criticism can be abused. Higher criticism versus lower criticism. Lower criticism is textual criticism. That's what it's called. Yep. Higher criticism would be things like studying the matters of who wrote the Gospels and when were they written, to whom were they written, what were their sources. It's the kind of stuff that you study in a New Testament introduction book. That's higher criticism. Now, you'll have some people involved in higher criticism who are skeptics, and they will come to skeptical conclusions. But that doesn't mean that higher criticism yields necessarily skeptical conclusions, any more than when you have evangelicals like Carson and Moo who write their New Testament introduction and they arrive at conservative conclusions. They're still doing higher criticism. It doesn't mean that higher criticism, oh, that's an evangelical discipline. Well, it's the same thing with redaction criticism. Redaction criticism in itself is neutral, but you'll have some people who come to negative or skeptical conclusions, but it doesn't mean that redaction criticism is bad. Sometimes it can be misleading, I think, but it doesn't mean it's bad. It just depends what the practitioner is doing with it.
And maybe this would be kind of a nice test case, and then we can move on to just maybe one or two last questions, right? But for instance, some of the scholars will say, for instance, when Jesus, it can't be historical Matthew 16 to 19 because, or at least 17 to 19, and yeah, that part, because, for instance, Jesus mentions a church, right? But, the historical Jesus, he didn't come to build a church, or, some people will say things like that, or, when the mentioning of the church is just the Matthean community inserting itself into the text, or, things like that. And I know, W.D. Davies and Dale Allison have written, I think, 7 reasons against the consensus and so on and so forth. And even, Ulrich Luz in his book, Studies in Matthew, he admits the reasons for the consensus aren't great. And so, I don't know, I'm kind of venting my thoughts here, but what are your thoughts on at least the historicity of that passage, or at least, other things that are considered, just the work of the redactionist?
Well, to be honest with you, I haven't really looked at that passage to address that question that you're asking. So I can't really answer that. By the way, Dale Allison shared with me that he and W.D. Davies, they wrote the 4-volume commentary on Matthew when Dale was in his 20s.
Whoa, really?
I mean, that just, and he doesn't consider it to be the go-to commentary on Matthew today, which understandably, you grow a lot in your knowledge and insights after, since your 20s, and he's in his 60s now. So I understand that, but I mean, that just shows you what an extraordinary scholar he is, So I can't really answer about that passage, but there's another one. Some scholars would say that when in the Gospel of John, it talks about followers of Jesus being like the man who was born blind, and Jesus heals him, gives him his sight back, and he ends up being excommunicated from the synagogue because he becomes like a follower of Jesus. And some skeptical scholars will say, well, that couldn't have happened because Christians weren't being excommunicated from the synagogue at that point. Well, how do you know that? How do you know that? We don't have enough information from antiquity to say that could not have happened. And I think about, well, maybe they say, well, you don't have enough information to say that. Well, we do have one report, the Gospel of John, that's first century. And here you've got Paul, who is very shortly after Jesus' death, he's persecuting Christians. He is arresting them. He's consenting to their stoning. He's consenting to their imprisonment, their executions. Do you think that just happened overnight? That all of a sudden, hey, Christians are fine. And then the very next day, they're killing them? There's probably a little ramping up with this. And if Paul is going out shortly after Jesus' death and he's persecuting these Christians, I think it's entirely reasonable, it's plausible to say that, followers of Jesus were being excommunicated from synagogues. These tensions were growing even during the ministry of Jesus, so that shortly thereafter, they just said, let's crush this cult once and for all. So I haven't looked at that particular passage, but I think we just have to be careful. You can come up with all sorts of explanations that can sound really good. I suspect that 1,000 years from now, if the Lord tarries and hasn't come, you will probably have some really wacko historians that will say that 9/11 never happened. Yeah. And I can make a good case for that, you could say. Okay, so what's the case against 9/11 actually happening? Now, this is 1,000 years from now, okay? Well, on July 28th, 1945, there was a plane that took off, a B-25 took off from Massachusetts, and shortly after 10 a.m., flew into the tallest skyscraper in the world between the 78th and 80th floors, killing everyone on board. All right. So it took off, and this is a true story. It's the same floors that the 767 flew into the South Tower on 9/11. It's within the same hour, just after 10 a.m. And it killed everybody on board. Now I could say, well, it took off, after 9 a.m. and it killed 11 people on board. That's 9/11. That's one thing right there. Let's look at the symbolism. That's the same floors. I mean, come on, that should grab your attention. And look at the symbolism. What symbolism? Well, the U.S. was going through its greatest economic recession in its history at that point. And that's symbolized by the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings. And the U.S. was also losing its influence around the world, and that's symbolized by the crash into the Pentagon. And all this happening, the declining U.S. influence and the economic recession we were in, it impacted the layperson, the average person. And so that is symbolized by the crash in the Pennsylvania farm field. So 9/11 never happened. You can modern mythologize anything like this, and you can make it sound reasonable. If it's like 1,000 years from now, you can make it sound reasonable. What about the videos? Come on, you got all kind of, you had Steven Spielberg, all that.
Stanley Kubrick and the moon landing, right?
That's right. And there will be people who deny that 9/11 actually happened. Well, you can do the same thing with the New Testament. You can make some of these things try to fit. And some of them you can't disprove, but you got to look at and say, well, what seems most reasonable here? Yeah, so that's what I'd say about some of that.
Right. Let me just ask you one last question, and then we can wrap it up. And so I was going to ask you about, your criteria for best explanation, but
Yeah.
that's in your public work, and that's in your book. And so, um, man, maybe I can try two at once, if that's
Okay.
okay. Okay. So one is that I really want to get your thoughts on the use of Bayes' theorem on historical matters, and especially, with the resurrection of Jesus. And then the second one is just, kind of a dead horse, but can a historian investigate miracle claims? Those are kind of two questions I want to ask you.
Okay, so Bayes' theorem. Let's just talk about that. I'm not an expert in it,
Sure. Yeah.
but I have a basic knowledge. So Bayes' theorem is a way of calculating the probability of an event, and it's based on a number of different components. And one of the components, a major component, is what's called the prior probability. So let me oversimplify this. Okay, you have a prior probability and a posterior probability. Prior probability is what's the probability of an event occurring before the alleged event, and the posterior probability, looking at the evidence, what's the probability that the event occurred. Bayes' theorem is more complex than that, but that just gives you a little idea. So prior probability would be like the lottery. I'm thinking of buying a lottery ticket. What's the prior probability of me winning? Well, it depends on the lottery and whatever, but let's just say 1 chance in 400 million. Now, someone comes to me and says, maybe I met someone that I knew in college, and I see them, meet them in the airport sometime. And we get talking. He says, hey, man, I won the lottery. And really? Yeah, I won it big. Okay, well, the first thing I can think of, what's the prior probability of that happening? 1 chance in 400 million. Do I have reason to doubt him just right off the cuff? Well, I guess so. So, but then he starts to share some evidence with me. He says, hey, look, this is where I lived. I was in a mobile home. Now I'm in a mansion. I used to drive a Beater. Here's a picture of it. Now I drive a Bentley. I'm retired. I don't have a job. I'm just, traveling the world now. And look, here's my investment portfolio. Well, now I've got this evidence that I'm seeing. And maybe, there's some eyewitnesses, people who know him there. He's got an entourage, people trying to get money from him or whatever, and they say, yeah, man, this guy's big stuff now. Well, that evidence easily overcomes the prior probability. Okay. So here's what happens when you come to say you're doing a historical investigation. A lot of times we can't know the prior probability. And so there's a huge portion of Bayes' theorem, at least a third of it, that you can't do. So why not just abandon that? You can still do the other stuff with the posterior probability, but you really can't do Bayes' theorem proper. Like, for example, okay, so the historical question, did the US drop nuclear bombs on Japan in World War II? How do you calculate the prior probability of that? Well, you can't. There's no way to calculate the prior probability of whether the US dropped nuclear bombs on Japan in World War II. It had never been done before. You can look at different reasons why we might have, but what's the prior probability? You can't do it. It's inscrutable. Or let's look at another thing in science. What's the prior probability of black holes? Well, you can't calculate that. Why? Because black holes are theoretical entities posited to explain observable phenomena. In the same way, a hypothesis, historical hypothesis, it's a hypothesis posited to explain certain data. So you really, how do you calculate the prior probability that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, you've got maybe 100 billion people who have lived and none of them have been raised from the dead. Well, how do you know that? You've got possibility of Jesus here. And you may have some people whom he's raised from the dead. And what about some testimonies of people who are raised from the dead by pastors or evangelists today in third world countries? You can't just a priori exclude those. And Jesus wasn't merely a man. If he was who he claimed to be, if he's the uniquely divine Son of God, that changes things. That puts Jesus in a different reference class than typical humans. You say, well, that's special pleading. No, it isn't. So another example, what's the prior probability of someone walking on water, a human walking on water? So, well, it's not very good, So let's just say you got all these people, the 7 billion people in the world today, and the governments, they work it out, and they keep track of everyone they test. They try to walk across a swimming pool or a lake or a pond or the sea or something, a river, and none of them can do it. And finally, there's a 5-year-old boy left, and it's his turn. And so I tell him to grab my hands. He grabs my hands. I hold him over a swimming pool. I walk along the side of the swimming pool, and he walks on water. So 7 billion people unable to walk on water doesn't mean he can't. You say, well, Mike, that's cheating because you assisted him. No, it's not cheating, because the question was, what's the prior probability? You're trying to find out what's the prior probability that someone can walk on water. You didn't specify that they had to be unassisted. So now if you're going to talk about a different reference class, because he's assisted, that puts him in a different reference class than those who were unassisted. It's a game changer if I help him. So with Jesus, it's a game changer if he was God's uniquely divine son. Now, you can't presuppose he was, but you shouldn't a priori exclude it either. So that kind of makes it very difficult to come up with a prior probability for the resurrection or for certain miracles of Jesus. And so you're missing a huge, huge element in the matter of Bayes' theorem. And that's why the majority of historians today eschew using it. And there's a lot of subjectivity involved in it. But you can use some other things that would be like explanatory power, given the truth of the hypothesis. What kind of things do we expect, and do we get these things? Are these the kinds of things we would expect? Given the evidence that we have today, what's the probability that the resurrection occurred? What's the probability that we would have the evidence that we have today if the resurrection did not occur? So you look at those kinds of things. Those are elements within Bayes' theorem that I think are legitimate. But Bayes' theorem as a whole, if you're looking at all the elements, I don't think it's a legitimate way to look at history.
Yeah, and so to get kind of a thought on your answer to the question of whether or not a historian can investigate miracle claims, I remember you were talking on your show about John, how do you say his last name, Meyer, on A Marginal Jew?
Yeah, John Meyer.
John Meyer, yeah. And so I think your conclusion was the historian can investigate the claim Jesus rose again from the dead, but he can't just say God raised Jesus from the dead. You believe that you could investigate the former, but not the latter. Is that a correct assessment of your view?
Yeah, no, I think, okay, so here's an analogy I like to give. So let's just say that scientists, astronomers know that there's a comet that is headed toward the moon, and they calculate that it's going to crash on the moon on a certain day and time. And so at that time, the appointed time, the Hubble Space Telescope and planetariums around the world are zoomed in on the lunar surface. And at that appointed time, bam, the comet slams into the moon's surface. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message written on the surface that says, Jesus is Lord, and it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, an astronomer can look at that and say, well, we have no idea whatsoever on how that happened. But you wouldn't turn around and deny that the comet slammed into the moon's surface and that it left this message. You would just say, you might have some astronomer say, well, that's definitely God, the Christian God that did it. You might have some other astronomer saying, no, that's just, who knows how this happened? Maybe, you might have a Muslim saying, well, maybe it's Satan who has done this to deceive people. And others might say, you know what? I don't believe that God exists, but I can't explain this. I can't deny it, but I can't explain the cause behind it. So I think a historian can look at the evidence and say, well, yeah, when we applied strictly controlled historical method, it strongly suggests that the resurrection hypothesis describes what happened. Resurrection of Jesus probably occurred. But you'll have some historians that would say, well, yeah, and God probably did it. And others would say, I just don't know. I can't explain. It's like Geza Vermesh, the Jewish historian who died a few years ago. In his book, he looks at 6 different possibilities and finally just says, I don't like any of them. So I just don't know what happened. But I think it's a historian could look at the evidence and come to the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead, and just say, as a historian, though, I cannot prove that God was the cause. I cannot say anything pertaining to the cause, because as a historian, I don't have the tools to be able to determine what the cause was. Now, I do think you could posit a theoretical entity, God, as the cause, and you'd be fine to do that as a historian.
Mhm.
In my book, I was just trying to be as careful and reserved as possible and just say, I think the evidence, strictly controlled historical method, yields the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead, but I can't say that God did it.
Right. Well, Dr. Licona, thank you so much for this interview. I've had such a great time with you. And once again, Dr. Licona is the author of multiple books, including The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. Dr. Licona, thank you for making high school and college great for me. So, I've loved your work. I've loved watching your debates. I mean, it's just, I've been really blessed by your ministry. And so, so for my viewers who have been keeping up with me, I've been discerning either, what I'm going to do with my future, and Houston Baptist University is on the table as a live option. And so, Dr. Licona, it'd be cool to study under you, and but of course, we'll see how the Lord plays things out. But Dr. Licona, thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome, Swan, and I'd love to have you come to HBU and study with you. So yeah, come on, man. But pleasure being on your show. God bless you, brother. And man, again, I'm really impressed that you read 300 and some pages of that book in one sitting while a high school student. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't know if I can pull that feat again, but we'll see.